Hey everyone, back again. Today I'm going to start a two-part series on Ngũgĩ Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind. But before jumping into it, hi, I'm David. I explain philosophical concepts and ideas and ways to make them accessible to you. So if you're new here, you can see videos. If you subscribe, you can see videos I release every single week. Not every week. More like once every 2 weeks now because I'm busy. If you found this as a podcast, I should say, you should be able to find my other videos on YouTube that sometimes have, that actually have video. If you found this on YouTube, you're going to be able to find all my episodes as podcasts, pretty much all my episodes. I don't know why now's the time I'm telling this, but there are many that were in the wrong audio format, and so some people, like some of my early Lacan ones, are not available, I think, on like Spotify, and they're only whatever. But if you want to help me out, you can like, share, subscribe. You can do that monetarily via Patreon or PayPal. But before considering doing that, consider donating to one of the organizations below to help Palestinians and Lebanese in need right now. So let's jump into Ngũgĩ Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind. Now this episode is going to cover chapter 1, and then the next episode will cover the remainder of the book. And this is such an important text. It's important because it gives such important historical contextual background of Ngũgĩ's own background in Kenya. And it will necessarily also look at the broader histories of European colonialism all throughout Africa. Specifically how in 1884, the Berlin Conference, which was a meeting place and a moment of the meeting of many European leaders, got together and pretty much decided how they would carve up Africa for their own interests. Now, one of the difficult things about speaking about this topic, on top of the horrors implied in the subject matter themselves, is that it often performs the added erasure of equating European colonialism with African history, because, and even saying it like that as though there's one singular African history is just a product of colonialism. That is absolutely not the case. And it's important to really get at the nuance of local people's actual experiences with colonialism, while also understanding it as a broad, homogenous, violent movement. And that's what I think Ngũgĩ does really well here, is really get into the nitty-gritty of what it means to be somebody living under colonialism and all of the pernicious ways that it manifests and what to do in the face of that. How does one actually work to decolonize? And more than that, how does one work to decolonize the mind? Because that's pretty important. Now, obviously, people have been living all across Africa for thousands and thousands of years. And they were all self-governing, self-sustaining communities. Absolutely. But in the 19th century, that would really change, and for the centuries leading up to it, because colonial conquest didn't really start there. But in the 19th century, it really took on massive proportions, with different European countries fighting for different parts of Africa, like how the Dutch were fighting in South Africa, how there were various interests the French had in Northern Africa versus the English, and so on and so forth. And many of these colonial conquests, they are not reserved for Africa, of course. They extended well into the Americas, well into the Middle East, and beyond. It's the history of European colonialism and the violence that it has wrought cannot be understated. One of the common things that people who decide all of a sudden they care about colonialism like to say is like, oh, well, how come you don't care about other kinds of colonialism? Which is already a very bad argument, because you're admitting that it is colonialism and therefore is bad. And the thing is, there is no colonialism in the history of the world that can compare with European colonialism at all, or simply just British colonialism in itself, just on its own. Now, in the 1884 conference, when European leaders got together to figure out which countries were going to own which parts of Africa, this was not only an effort to extend European influence into these areas to procure resources and to procure land, maybe strategic trade routes, anything like that. it was also an effort to transform that part of the world into whichever country was taking control of it. And one of the most pernicious ways, one of the most effective tools that colonizers use is to impose their own language upon colonized people. And for very good reason, and that is exactly the topic of this book, is the question of language. That is, how should colonized people respond to this act of dispossession of their own language? That is where instead a colonizer is imposing their language on a colonized people. What happens to one's mind, and what should people do about that? How should they challenge that? How should they oppose it? Now we're going to get into the way that languages have a unique and singular attachment to a culture, to a worldview, or to cultures, to worldviews, and so on. But really, one of the most immediate things about the idea of imposing a language on someone is that at any time now that they try to think through their situation, they have to do it through the language of the colonizer. And that's the colonizer's secret hope, is that at that point, if a colonized person begins to think about how to challenge colonialism, they must do so in the language of the colonizer, therefore signaling that to some extent the colonial project has been completed because the act of linguistic infection has happened. And once that has happened, so too, then therefore, has there been a cultural infection, because language and culture are intimately connected. There's so much to unpack about this. Many people of you listening who speak more than one language know very well that there are different ideas, concepts, experiences, perceptions, everything like that, that are available in some languages, but not available in others. Not to mention just like basic concepts that might seem to be on the surface similar between two languages, actually don't have that same meaning between the two languages. It might be totally contextual too, and there's really just so much to it, like in unpacking the relationship between language and culture and how they both shape one another. So colonized people, in this case colonized African people, are forced to think through their experience of colonialism through a colonial language, whichever one it is. So one of the things that Ngũgĩ is going to draw our attention to here is the entire contingent of African writers who adopt colonial languages to think through the horrors of colonialism. For example, Chinua Achebe, who wrote Things Fall Apart, and he's a Nigerian writer. And Things Fall Apart is an anti-colonial text through and through. It is a story of, if I can remember, it's the story of protagonist named Okonkwo, who has earned his self-fulfilled spot as leader of his village's he's earned the leadership role in his village, and his power is slowly usurped, and he's eventually undermined by his own bad actions. And this is happening against the backdrop of a kind of looming colonialism, where he is witnessing the death of his own identity and culture as he's trying desperately to cling on to a fading idea about his own power and masculinity. Very powerful text. But Ngũgĩ kind of points to this to say that, how radical can a text like this really be if it is written in the language of the colonizer? And the thing is, this is obviously super complicated, and who am I to be like, yeah, you, as a colonized people, you must do this in order to properly oppose colonialism. I think it's really complicated, and I think it's important to acknowledge that Ngũgĩ's perspective, although it's something I really agree with, is only one possible way to approach the decolonial struggle and the adoption of colonial languages to essentially turn them back against colonizers. And if you look more deeply into the field of so-called post-colonial studies, you'll find that there are like figures like Anzaldúa and Homi Bhabha and Ortega and others think through decolonial resistance not as an effort to reclaim a lost past, but to embrace future possibilities that, see a kind of blending of, or hybridity between the colonizer and the colonized. Now, obviously, there's a lot of problematic elements within these thought patterns, and I don't mean to suggest that this is a solution in itself, but just to highlight the complexity of the situation. And in any case, this is why I really agree with Ngũgĩ, is to say that it's super problematic to say that, like as though colonized people should adopt the I and language and culture of the colonizer in order to mount any kind of resistance to the colonizer. And for Ngũgĩ, we won't be able to separate this from class either, where it was mostly, especially in the Kenyan context, mostly the most privileged people in Kenya who got to learn English. And he's not saying that they got to benefit because they got to learn English, but because of all of the other privileges that came with that. Whereas people who didn't necessarily have that privilege, like people of the lower classes, the peasant class, and so on, were still forced to speak their mother tongue, which was for many people Gikuyu or Kikuyu in Kenya, which is largely spoken by the Bantu people. Now, this question of language came to a head for Thiong'o in 1962, which was right before Kenyan independence, and it was right after. This was at the 10-year mark of the Mau Mau revolution, which we'll talk about a bit in a bit. But the Mau Mau were the Freedom Army movement in Kenya, the anti-colonial, decolonial Freedom Army movement. But in 1962 in Uganda, there was a conference titled African Writers of English Expression. And of course, this excluded the great Shaban Robert, who wrote he wrote in Kiswahili, and, for example, Chief Fagunwa, who had wrote most of his texts in Yoruba. And so the title of the conference, just to repeat it, African Writers of English Expression, pretty much set the stage to exclude all African writers who were not writing in English, like those who were writing in Arabic or Yoruba or Ido or Gikuyu or any other language that is not English or another European language. Not to mention, or so many more, like Zulu, for example, and so on. But beyond the problematic core of this conference that only seemed to exclude English-speaking, quote-unquote, African people, at this conference, like the other thing was at the level of substance, was they were largely pondering questions that normalized and naturalized the presence of colonial languages within Africa. So they asked questions like, what is African literature? Is literature written by Africans? What if an African writer writes in a European language? Or what if an African writer writes about an African person in England, for example? Or what if it's set in an African country, but it's written by a European, for example? And all of these questions began to swirl, and Ngũgĩ was there like, are we really just going to pretend as though English just deserves to be here, and it just deserves to have its presence in this space, in our country, in our communities? We're just going to pretend then that we can engage in these kinds of thought experiments about what it means to be African, what it means to produce African literature, which is on its own. You don't really hear the term European literature. You often just hear literature to stand in for literature itself, for European literature. And then every other derivative is going to be qualified with a continent. You have Asian literature, African literature, and then more specifically like Chinese literature, whatever. And this phenomenon works in such a way as to essentially like normalize European artistic contributions, or to frame them as the kind of center around which then everything else is measured. Now, Thiong'o acknowledges that there's like so much potential behind adopting a colonial language. And one of the reasons for that, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a little bit, is that because colonialism is so violent and powerful, it actually produces the conditions for many people who would have spoken many different languages to all speak the same language, and it allows people to unite. And I think that Ngũgĩ, who I flip-flop between Ngũgĩ and Thiong'o because I'm in the patriarchal paternalistic way, I gravitate towards saying last names, but Thiong'o is not, like, that's not really how that works in his language. Like, he's Ngũgĩ, and when you have someone like with the same first name, you like separate them, or you're able to distinguish them by who their father was. And in his case, his father was Thiong'o. So I like to refer to him as Ngũgĩ because I think that's what he prefers. But so there is a potential here. There is a potential in the adoption of colonial languages as a tool of unity against the colonizer. And this is essentially the double bind. This is like, no matter what the solution is or what the course of action is, ultimately it's not good for colonized people in so many cases. Where if colonized people are forced to adopt colonial languages to such an extent that their liberation depends on it, and it's like you have to adopt the language in order to free yourself from the colonizer, therefore signaling that you are submitting to the colonizer to free yourself from the colonizer, at least submitting to their language. And there's like a kind of violence here, and it comes about through training and through education, where he says that the physical violence of the battlefield was followed by the psychological violence of the classroom, where he says that language was the means of spiritual subjugation. And it makes total sense. I never wish anybody has to have loses their language. I think it's one of the most important connections that people can have with themselves and the world, because even that little voice in your head and the kind of inner monologue or dialogue you have with yourself, that is kind of the only person you really talk to all the time, that gives you your sense of self. Imagine if you couldn't do that in your language anymore, or you were forced to, in all of your outward expressions, to use another language out of fear of being persecuted. Because indeed, people would be persecuted if they didn't speak the colonizer's language. And in his own life, Ngũgĩ remembers the violence Europeans inflicted on his language, that is Gikuyu, and his community. He was forced to harvest beans and other crops for his European and African landlords. He and other children would tell stories of the resilience of small animals. Like, for example, they used to tell stories about frogs and rabbits or hares against predatory animals like lions and hyenas and stuff. And they would tell these stories to one another in Gikuyu, which was the language mostly of still the peasant classes who hadn't been given the opportunity to go to school. Which isn't to say that school is a good thing, because school is a colonial tool in these cases, which is like another one of those really difficult issues where on the one hand, many people are very willing to celebrate the emergence of schools in many parts of the world, and there's some good to it, but at the same time, we cannot ignore how schooling has been a tool for the systematic colonialism and assimilation of so many people across the world for so many centuries. So the stories that they used to tell each other as little children, as I've already suggested, they primarily focused on animals. But when they did include humans, they illustrated humans kind of in a constant struggle against some kind of a violent predator, be it an animal or another human being. And there was a kind of alliance drawn between those vulnerable animals and vulnerable humans. And this would come to very much, or this I think perfectly illustrates the way that Ngũgĩ thinks about language and thinks about the use of language as and how it unites people. It's that it allows people to unite in a common experience of opposition to oppression. And it is a language that allows people to struggle and to free themselves from the bondage of colonialism, of repression, and of everything like that. But it's also a tool of oppression. It is also a tool of subjugation when language is imposed upon people. Now, when he and his friends used to tell stories to one another, their stories extended far beyond just the words themselves, where he argues that one of the European linguistic colonial tools is the imposition of written language, where writing does something to language, where writing essentially makes it so that you lose all of the embodied dimension of communication in the act of storytelling. Which isn't to say you can't still tell stories with writing, but for his people in Gikuyu, in Kenya, it was like you need all of these other dimensions to tell the story effectively, because you need to add certain tones and inflections to your voice to communicate certain things properly. Just as, and this is the case for many different languages that rely upon a lot upon the embodied act of speaking as an important element of clarity within what they are saying so that the other person will understand them. It is part of the language itself. It's effectively an extension of that language. But the European mindset, in its continuous effort to abstract things from the world, is very quick to adopt something like writing that is a kind of abstraction of language. It kind of reduces it to a completely abstract and detached form from humanity. Now, little asterisk, obviously conversations about the distinction between speech and writing and oral and written cultures is a lot more complicated than that, depending on who you read. But just, if you're willing to humor me, is to at the very least acknowledge the way that writing, for many people who rely upon so much more than just the words to communicate something as a story or just to communicate at all, writing can be really, really violent. And it would also have a kind of musical harmony to it that colonialism would try to do away with in favor of the more abstract use of language, the rote memory about how to have proper writing instruction, I'm sure maybe many of you listening remember having to learn to write in cursive if you happen to go to a certain Western school or Western inspired school, as though there's anything really useful about learning how to write in cursive. Yet so much time is done training people in how to be technically proficient at writing, and we spend considerably less time teaching people how to actually do things with words, like storytelling. It's like we see this play out in so many different ways. Like there's the popular film Whiplash about a jazz drummer. And one of the things that movie does is convey the extent to which in the West, and in America specifically, there is just an implicit association with technical proficiency, and in this case, musical proficiency. And it's a trap that many prospective musicians, including myself, fall into, where we think that if we just train hard enough in being technically good at playing an instrument, then that means that we are musically inclined, when that's not true at all. It takes a whole different kind of study, one that is difficult to really discipline, and it takes more of an embracement of newness and possibility that I believe rigid disciplinary technical learning is ill-equipped to actually provide. But in our highly self-disciplinary culture within the West more broadly, it starts to really equate these things like technical proficiency with, in this case, musical proficiency, or writing proficiency with the actual act of writing, confusing that with the storytelling proficiency, which is exactly what Ngũgĩ is calling attention to here. The European imposition of training and regimen and control in lieu of the more organic way, as per the thousands of years of his own community arriving at this point and their long, rich history of storytelling, that all being swept under the rug, that just being erased in favor of this European mode of storytelling, of sharing ideas, of communicating. Now, in 1952, it was mandated, the Kenyan government, backed by English colonial powers, put in a state of emergency. And in the state of emergency, among other things, it imposed, it standardized English teaching all across the country. And it's extremely interesting, I think, to see that the imposition of English as being a way to control people during a state of emergency, because they know very well that linguistic colonialism is a way to render the people docile and to pacify them. It's a way to alienate them from their own heritage and culture, and to give them the tools. I'm really going to use the word tools, is to make them artificially align themselves with the colonizer in their shared language. So children would be punished if they were caught speaking Gikuyu or any other language. The schools put in, how did they work? The schools put in a kind of snitching system where they would give out these kinds of like markers. It was almost like a stamp. And if a student heard another student talking in Gikuyu or not talking in English, they would give them this stamp or this marker. And at the end of the day, the teacher would ask who has the marker, and that student would then be forced to say who gave it to them. And then that student would have to say who gave it to them, and so on, all the way back down the chain. And what that effectively did was it turned students against one another, which is one of the other really pernicious tools of colonialism, is to divide people. And you're able to divide people when you create these kinds of divisions, or when you create these kinds of conflicts in a hyper-surveillance system like this, like colonialism imposes, that makes everyone suspicious and wary of everybody else. And it also began, as far as divisions go, because speaking English was so highly valued, students who were the least intelligent, even according to European standards, would excel the most and would be given the most privileges if they demonstrated proficiency in English. So if you had a student that was really good at math, if they happen to be really good at math, which is something that the colonial education system valued, they would actually be undervalued compared to somebody who knew how to proficiently speak English. And so what you got was like this added dimension of merit just not really being considered at all, or like education not actually being valued, but instead just essentially allegiance to European languages and culture as being valued. Now, why are languages so important? Well, to understand this, Ngũgĩ goes back to Marx. He draws upon Karl Marx to say that humans undergo kind of three broad phases in the adoption of language, and kind of through a similar concomitant development in economic processes, where at first language and community and culture are kind of intertwined, and it emerges as people start to communicate with one another to learn how to do things like agriculture, how to work together to procure food, how to work together to make like tools that'll make it easier to get food, how to do trade, and so on. Then spoken language would really arrive as a tool to unite ourselves in our common, after having been established over years of like careful and slow adoption of language. Spoken language being codified to some extent, then allowed the emergence of communities aligned within shared visions about how to best procure food, how to best grow food, how to best hunt, how to best do any of those things. And then finally, written language would emerge as a kind of container for spoken language. And again, there's a lot more to this conversation around spoken versus written language and writing being a container. There's a lot to unpack here in terms of like media studies and stuff that pretty much says that treating writing as a container is an entry point to expansion, where if you are able to write something down, you're able to transmit that message to places that your voice can't reach. And so therefore, you're able to then organize a people along, further and further away to be part of the imagined community, as Benedict Anderson writes about it, an imagined community that believes themselves to share things when actually they really don't. That's why, at least written language is one of the tools to do that, which is why Ngũgĩ thinks it's like super important that Kenyan people return to their oral-based Gikuyu approach to language, to storytelling, as we will see in the next episode, to theater, and so on. Now, over time, as language and culture are repeated over and over and over again, people develop a sense of themselves through that culture. And you can just think about your own self. And part of the projects of the thing called critical theory, and much of what people learn in colleges, is to try to find a way to really understand who they are once they interrogate things like their gender, once they interrogate things like their class, once they interrogate things like the way they've internalized power, the way they've internalized discipline, and so on. One of the lingering questions is like, what remains of you once you've interrogated these things? Because indeed, if they really confront this stuff, no one really stays the same. And do you become more truly yourself after you've done this process? Do you just become a self that is not your own in the adoption and of this like ivory tower college like level learning? That might be a more pessimistic way to look at it, but in any case, I think it's an important question. But this just goes to show the extent to which that our sense of self is very much bound up with context, bound up with our culture, bound up with what we learned, bound up with our language, and so on, which is why it's very important to protect languages. Now, colonizers want to control resources. Essentially, that's kind of their end goal, because Ngũgĩ is also very committed to Marxism, not only Marx too, but Lenin. So he recognizes that the guiding impetus behind colonialism is the effort to steal resources. And to do so, colonizers must control the minds and hearts of the people through two primary methods. It continuously demeans the culture and language of colonized people, and it elevates their culture and language of the colonizer above those of the colonized. And Ngũgĩ writes about this to say that learning for a colonial child became a cerebral activity and not an emotionally felt experience, because the child, when they have been indoctrinated through and in colonial education systems, they have been taken out of their context, forced to adopt a new language, new culture, in a space that is heartless, like a completely abstract space, like a classroom. And so they don't have an embodied attachment to that space. And this alienates people. Obviously, it alienates them from their communities, from their countries, from their languages, and therefore alienates them from themselves. So, and this happens when we learn, like if anyone knows what happens when you learn a new language in adulthood, is that you often do this thing where you like translate the language into your original language. And that's how you actually learn this new language, and eventually you get comfortable enough with it that you don't need to do that translating. But what happens is that there's always like a kind of distance between you and having embodied feelings and attachments in that new language, because you don't have that immediate emotional embodied response. It takes a long time to get there because you have to be continually translating what you're learning into your language. And so you're actually alienated from that language as well. And you're alienated from your own possibility of having an embodied attachment to any world. That is, if yours has been taken from you. And this corresponded to a broader European Western emphasis on rationality in the mind over bodies and emotion. And in this process, then, colonized people are denied the opportunity to have a mirror in the culture that they're immersed in, because they don't see themselves in European culture, in European art, in European fiction, European philosophy. They don't see their own struggles, their own lives, their own experiences reflected there. And so they're totally alienated from all of that. And so African people, in this case, in this context, Kenyans, who are forced to essentially adopt European culture, not only lose their own heritage, culture, and language, or put them seriously in jeopardy and at risk, what they're met with when they actually enter and are forced into the European paradigm is racism. They're forced to read people like Hegel and Kant, who believe that people in Africa are somehow less developed than people in Europe. And so it's not only that they don't see themselves, but they're repeatedly reminded that they are inferior to white Europeans. Now, in African nations, the bulk of art and literature comes from the people of the middle classes. And this is a problem for Ngũgĩ, because the literature produced in European languages was given the identity of African literature as a whole, as though if there had been literature in Africa, which is like, for Ngũgĩ, this was one of the defining moments in the history of African reception vis-a-vis the European gaze, because when people of a certain class within many different African countries were writing in European languages, suddenly Europeans began to recognize some kind of similarities. They could split apart themes within these languages that were just adopting the European languages. And so it was given a kind of homogenous identity as African literature, but that obviously doesn't exist. There's no such thing as homogenous African literature or culture or identity. And one of the common things to emerge out of this so-called African literature, or that was common among many African writers writing in European languages, was that their characters, many of whom were depicted as experiencing this crisis of identity. And it makes sense, because they're depicting people of African descent who are thrown into colonial settings that are totally foreign to them, make no sense to them, while they're told that their heritage and their culture are somehow less developed, are not worthy of retaining, not worthy of holding on to. And so you see this phenomenon, you see it in Things Fall Apart, and so many other texts, with so many people like struggling to find their sense of identity at this critical juncture between maintaining a past and a history and being forced to adopt violently a new colonial language and culture. But this wasn't representative of all the people. I mean, the people who were writing, who were being taken up by Europeans, were mostly people of well-off, privileged people in Kenya in this context, or in other nations in Africa. They did not represent, that is, this literature, this art and culture that was emerging, did not represent all the people. It never could, but it definitely didn't represent the lower classes and peasant classes that were really responsible, as Ngũgĩ lays out, really responsible for keeping African languages alive. No surprise then that these people would lead the decolonial charge. For example, Gahara wa Wanja, who was jailed by the British for 10 years for writing in Gikuyu in Kenya. And in prison he wrote journals published as Mwandiki wa Mau Mau Ita Mirio Ini. Ita Mirio Ini. I take it very seriously. And about the Mau Mau Freedom Army that opposed British colonialism. Now, colonialism has reduced African languages to writing, as I kind of alluded to earlier, and this is part of the broader project of abstracting the real embodied, felt and, really just embodied experience of communication that within Europe is often renounced in favor of just this purely abstract thing called writing. But for Ngũgĩ, and this will become apparent next episode when we look more at theater, is that in Kenyan culture, there's so much more to communicating than just the words you use. It comes down to your body language. It comes down to context. It comes down to the place you're in when you're speaking. It comes down to the tone in your voice. It comes down to the inflections that you give certain words that all participate in communicating something to somebody. And to just reduce all language to writing as a kind of abstract way to universalize communication completely gets rid of all of that, therefore getting rid of cultural modes of connection and unity. And here is the birth of this so-called African culture, especially around this, as more and more people began to write. It wasn't even as though, or it wasn't bad enough that European colonizers forced African people to adopt their languages, forced them to adopt their communication styles as well with writing, therefore homogenizing all of these different communities and nations in their methods of storytelling and reducing them all to writing, giving it a kind of universal homogeneous form. And it was also a way to gatekeep and to make divisive the ability to communicate, where only those most privileged with the most wealth, Kenyans, could be given the opportunity to write things down that Europeans could then celebrate, and that could then be interpreted as standing in for the African experience. And this is why it's so important for him to write in Gikuyu, which became more apparent for him in the mid-70s, which we'll talk about a bit more in next episode. But as he writes, as Ngũgĩ writes, he says that, but writing in our language per se, although a necessary first step in the correct direction, will not itself bring about the Renaissance in African culture, or cultures, I should say, if that literature does not carry the content of our people's anti-imperialist struggles to liberate their productive forces. So he continues, African languages addressing themselves to the lives of the people become the enemy of the neo-colonial state. And absolutely, it's not enough to just write in the language. Because if you just write in the language, who knows whose perspective is actually being represented there? It must be written in the language and also reflect the people's struggles, the people's experiences, not just the tiniest portion of people who happen to be the most privileged, but of everybody. Specifically those people who've been, their productive forces, their attachment to agriculture, their attachment to the land and their own culture has been taken from them. These are the most important voices to amplify. And yeah, that'll end us off here. Next time we'll pick up from chapter 2 and continue on with the rest of the book. If there's anything I got wrong, anything I omitted, I'd love to hear about it. You can leave a comment. I can pin it. Everyone can see. We can all learn from you, your brilliant mind. Let me know what you think. If this spurs anything in you, if you have any ideas about it, I'd love to hear about it. And yeah, I hope that this has been illuminating for you. It's certainly illuminating for me. And on that note, take care.